Good afternoon and welcome to People Making Money. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we are here every Wednesday at 12:30 p.m. Pacific time, 3:30 p.m. Eastern time, with an hour in for Central and Mountain. I think we've covered the whole United States except for way out there in Hawaii and Alaska, which I think they're 2 hours earlier than I am, but don't quote me on that. And I'm excited today because I have a guest I think you will find has a tremendous amount of insight that you can use in developing your own professional prospects, your own career or business. So I'm happy. I'm just going to get right into this without a whole lot of ado. And I'm happy to introduce Jonathan Malm. And Jonathan is the co-author of a new book called, let me get it here real quickly, How to Build Long-Term Energy, Health, and Success as a Ministry Leader. So I'll talk about the book in just a minute, but I want to give you a real brief biography about Jonathan so you can know his background. So Jonathan has helped thousands of churches through projects like SundaySocial.tv and ChurchStageDesignIdeas.com. And he consults with organizations on guest services and creative expression. So he and his co-author Jason have written several books, including The Comeback Effect, The Comeback Culture, The Volunteer Effect, and The Volunteer Survival Guide. And unlike me, who's in relatively cool Southern California, we were talking about this before the show started. Jonathan is in hot San Antonio, where he lives with his family. But he did assure me he recently replaced his air conditioner, and so he shouldn't be sweating during the interview. So, Jonathan, welcome to People Making Money. Thanks for coming on my show.
Thanks for having me. I realized I'm 38, but I feel like this is like when I finally hit adulthood, when I'm so excited about a new AC unit. I've been geeking out about it all day.
It sounds like that there's some TV commercial where they have this thing with the seminar turning into your parents, right? It's like,
yeah, that's where I'm at right now.
So welcome to adulthood. You'll hate it, you know. So Jonathan, if you don't mind, before we get into your book specifically, would you share a little bit about your professional journey? How did you get into doing the kind of consulting and writing that you did? I mean, was this something, as a kid you were thinking, gosh, what I want to do is, I want to help churches thrive, right? What did that journey look like? If you'll share at least some high points of that with us.
Yeah, I mean, so I grew up. My dad was a missionary in Guatemala. It was in the middle of a civil war, which was all sorts of craziness. But it was really cool to see him always in an entrepreneurial kind of approach. Like, he was always an entrepreneur. What he did down in Guatemala was largely taking short-term teams to, orphanages or to build a feeding center and just different things around the country. And I never really got to see him in a traditional job. So I always had this sort of entrepreneurial bent myself, where I would buy Guatemalan currency, and when we came back to the US, I would sell it. So I was a currency trader, but I always started businesses and always looked for, this could be a product or this could be something. And we moved back to the US, and my dad worked at a church. So obviously, as a pastor's kid, I started working at the church. But while I was there, I just saw a lot of needs in the church, because that's where I was working, right? So I saw needs for churches becoming more welcoming, needs for churches with staging, trying to, kind of captivate the imagination of people coming in, maybe expecting a stodgy church that doesn't really relate to my everyday life, and changing that. Now I think we've swung to the opposite extreme, where we do that too much a little bit. We make it too much about a show, but the goal was to challenge your perceptions about what church could be, right? And then, so in the middle of that, I started a company called SundaySocial.tv, which you mentioned. We create social media graphics that churches can use, kind of like a subscription, use whatever you need approach. And that's what I do full time now. With writing on the side. If you've ever written a book, unless it's a bestseller, you're probably not making a lot of money from it. Right. But more a labor of love for me and Jason both. But yeah, and then this book, Don't Burn Out, Burn Bright, was the result of, especially during COVID, seeing a lot of pastors, because those are primarily who I work with, but I know a lot of business leaders as well, dealing with burnout, just losing their passion for ministry, especially in churches. We won't always talk about churches, but this is kind of the atmosphere is, you have people that either, especially in Texas, were like, wear masks, or they're like, don't wear masks. And you're trying to have a church service and accommodate both of these extreme people. And there's all these spiritual elements involved where you feel like God is telling you one way or another. And it's this complexity that, you want to serve people, you want to make them happy, but you can't. It's impossible. So, man, there was a lot of burnout in COVID. And now we've seen a lot of the long tail, kind of like COVID, a lot of the long tail effects of that, where, maybe you survived, but now you're burning out because you got through the emergency and now you're just feeling the result of all that exhaustion. So we wanted to write this book because we don't think burnout is inevitable, both in ministry or in business, but it requires some very intentional discipline in life.
Mm-hmm. And I think that this really is the timely subject, right? Because I don't know how much you follow the business press, but I read the Wall Street Journal pretty much every day. And it seems like on a fairly regular basis, there are articles about burnout and not just among leadership, but even just among rank and file people. Mm-hmm. And I think some of it is COVID. And some of it is just the sort of tone of society today. And it's I used to see this. I mentioned we were talking about the 3 pillars of attainment before we started. This was a big problem when I was on deployment, where, you're on a ship and it's like day after day, and it's the same cycle of work over and over again. And how do you keep people vital and engaged in their lives, not just their work, but their lives, right? So where did I understand that was probably the genesis of the book. Where did you start in terms of figuring out the kind of ideas and recommendations you were going to make to people?
Yeah, so we identified 10 sources of burnout in people typically. A lot of it comes down to not being able to rest, not knowing how to rest. It comes down to things like boundaries, things like not operating from a strong set of values. There were 10 of them. And we worked with Jason, who's my co-writer. His wife is a counselor. So we worked really a lot with her on figuring out, okay, what are the negatives? And our goal obviously wasn't to create another book about burnout. Like you said, there are a lot of great articles about, recovery from burnout, how to know if you're burned out. Our goal was to hopefully get you before you got to that place. And so we took those 10 negatives and said, okay, now what are the positives? What are some pillars we can build into our lives that will actually keep us safe from the negatives, but also build strength and fortitude in our lives for those areas? So, I mean, one of my favorite chapters is, and I think this goes back to what you were saying, is the idea of how do you actually rest? Because we have more opportunity for leisure than we've ever had in our lives, right? At the same time, we feel like none of it is restful. And so we talk about in the book about freeing yourself from entanglements. We didn't want to call it addictions, but these things that, like, we enjoy them so much, but they zap our rest instead of giving us rest. So being on my phone all the day, for instance, that it simulates rest. I can spend 2 hours on Facebook and feel exhausted being on Facebook that long. So obviously it's not a leisure activity if I'm feeling exhausted from it. So we talk about, how do you know if something's causing you rest, or how do you know if it's an entanglement? And there are just a lot of things like that that are subtle tweaks I think we can make in our lives that will then build us to a healthy place.
So when you say a lot of them are tweaks, expand on that if you would, because tweaks sound like something, okay, I'll just like change this one little thing and then everything is kind of hunky dory. Is it really that simple, or are we looking at something broader than maybe I'll change this little thing here and this little thing here?
I mean, think about it like an engine. If you're maintaining it properly, most of what you're doing is, you're changing the oil, you're obviously adding gas in, you're, adjusting some things here and there, adjusting alignment. It's only whenever the car is having some serious problems that you need to replace the engine or need to do some massive transmission work, right? So our goal with this book was, if you're fully burnt out, I do believe you can get something from this, but this is probably not for you. You need to go to you need to get a counselor, really, like, and even if you're not burnt out, it's good to go to counseling, right? But you need to really dive into some soul work and kind of restructure some things. But yeah, these are largely small tweaks. So for instance, we talk about the idea of setting boundaries and understanding that, there are people who should have unlimited access to you, and there's people who should have limited access to you, and then people who are like your peers. And a lot of times we get those flipped. The squeaky wheel gets the grease, but those are usually the ones that shouldn't probably have access to us, unfettered access. And so things like that, just changing your mentality and realizing, okay, I'm going to shift some things around in my life. And I do believe it can yield some long-term huge results for you.
So let's talk about that, because I think this is something that a lot of people struggle with. I know I certainly do. So people pretty much have access to me whenever they want, right? So how do we say to someone who, well, first of all, who would you recommend we give unfettered access to versus, maybe somewhat restricted access? How do we make those decisions?
Yeah. So in the book, we kind of, we put it down to three different types of people. It's give to, get from, give to, and then live with. So the people that we get from, the people that are, speaking mentorship into our life, the people that are speaking life into our life, those are the people that we have unfettered access to our life, because they're going to help us avoid costly mistakes. They're going to be encouraging us when we're feeling discouraged. Whenever they see something that's out of line, I want them to be able to speak into my life, and I want them to be able to call me at 2 a.m. in the morning and say, hey, let's talk about this right now, right? Unlimited access. Then there are the people our peers that we just, we give access to, we get from. Obviously, that's pretty self-explanatory. But then there's the give to people. Those are the people that we mentor, the people that we are, in ministry sense, the people we're ministering to, the people that kind of maybe take a little bit of that life energy from us. We feel a little zapped afterwards. Now, again, I'm a believer. I'm a Christian. So we talk about who is my neighbor. Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. And he tells the story about the Good Samaritan, the person who was beat up on the side of the road, right? So there is this thing about loving people and giving to people, and whether you're a Christian or not, you believe in that. And so there is that time we do need to be giving to people. And so we can't set boundaries in such a way. We don't create walls to keep people out, but instead we think of it like a gate, where that gate lets people in. It sets the timing when we let people in. It can keep people out, but it's mostly more a structure for how we let people in. And it's important that we do that well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so one of the things that I've talked to people about over the years is we have to be able to say no to people, but in a way that we're not pushing them away. So I recommend to people, they say something like, well, no, but let me suggest this for you as a way to give the person another place they can go where they can get help, for example, right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise, you're right. They suck it up, and especially so. I think when someone is an introvert, interacting with people really does take that energy out of them, right? So whereas an extrovert, they tend to get energized by that. So how did you look at that issue in terms of, or did you look at that issue in terms of people having access to another person, that sort of thing?
Yeah. So, I mean, you kind of talking about two things there, the idea of, giving them alternatives, right? So the yes or no, but, right? So there is that. I mean, I would also even say that one of the things we talk about in the book is the idea of requiring motion from the other person. When I worked at a church, I would always have parents coming up to me. I was a worship leader, and they would say, "Can you teach my son guitar?" And sure, I would love to do that. So I would sit down with their son for the first lesson. We'd pull out our guitars, and I would say, "Okay, well, show me what you know." And within 2 seconds, it was clear that they've never touched that guitar before coming to sit with me. And I realized this person had no motion on their part. So it was taking me to put all the motion into helping them. So what I started to do is I said, okay, yes, I would be happy to teach your son how to play guitar. Watch these 3 YouTube videos, do what's on them, and then come to me whenever you've done that. And the result of that subtle change that I did was I never had a single parent actually follow through on that and send their kid to me. Not because they felt pushed away, but because their kids didn't follow through with it. I had to expect motion from them. So, to your point, yes. Oh, I would love to help you. I can help you whenever you get this, and this to me. And then let's go. And you'll find that so often nobody will get this, and you, right? Like you set up that boundary, you set up that structure, and you'll find that, man, it solves a lot of the problems just because people don't necessarily know what they want. They'll ask for help before they even really know what they need. And as they dive into it even a little bit, they'll realize, oh, I don't need that person. So that will often help you a lot of it. And then to your point about extroversion and introversion, I'm an extreme extrovert. I get energized around people. I love connecting people. I love all of that. But there are still people that, people in situations, especially whenever I'm giving so much that I feel exhausted. There comes a point where even as extroverted as I am, I need to lay down and sit by a beach and sip a margarita and talk to no one and just read my book, right? Like, so we all have different levels. And that's the thing. I think, it's hard to put an easy, like you need to spend 4 hours resting and 8 hours doing this. We're individuals. We have different needs, different capacities for different areas. And we really need to be aware of who we are and what our areas for potential burnout are. In fact, we created an assessment for the book, and it's free if you want to do it. It's at don'tburnoutburnbright.com. It's a free assessment, and it goes through those 10 areas. You can take it, and it'll just tell you which area you're maybe prone to burning out a little bit more. Because it is, we do need to be aware that certain things for some people, oh, I'll never burn out because of that. But this other area, that's going to be a cause for extreme exhaustion for me.
People don't realize this, and I've mentioned a few times on the show, I'm actually an extreme introvert. And it's so interesting to hear an extrovert say that even I get, exhausted sometimes, because the extroverts I know, they seem to be able to go on forever, like the Energizer Bunny or whatever, you know what I'm saying? But of course it makes sense. We're all more on a kind of a spectrum between, no one is really a pure introvert or a pure extrovert. So we're somewhere on that, like I say that.
And that's the thing. I think a lot of extroverts, maybe either they're, if you're talking about Enneagram, which is super popular, you're a 7 where you avoid negative emotions. So maybe you are tired, but you're like, I'm not going to deal with that. Right. So there's a little bit of self-awareness that comes of realizing, okay, yes, I do love this, but there's a limit. I love ice cream, but if I eat too much ice cream, my tummy's going to be hurting, right? Like even good things for us, things that we love, we need to set boundaries and limits on them.
Right. It's funny, just to digress for a minute, you mentioned Enneagrams. Scott Allender was on the show a few weeks ago talking about his book on Enneagrams. So yeah.
I'm a 7, so I definitely avoid those negative emotions. In fact, I told my wife when we were dating, she went to Paris for a couple of weeks, and I said, just so you know, I don't miss people. So we were dating. This was a horrible thing to say to her, but I was warning her. I'm like, I don't tend to miss people because I just don't think about those negative emotions. But since I've learned that maybe that's not a healthy way to approach life.
And I mean, and it's really sometime offline, I have to figure out why she married you despite that.
She loved the pain. She's a masochist. So.
We'll have to make sure her hair shirt gets dry clean. So, because you work with so many ministers and in the church setting, you mentioned something that I'd love for you to dive into really as deeply as you're willing to go. And that is, you said something about kind of spiritual exhaustion. And I think that in our society today, I think a lot of the exhaustion people are feeling is in fact spiritual exhaustion, even though they're not working in a church or a synagogue or anything like that, right? But it seems like life can be so oppressive and So talk if you would about that. And like I said, please go as deeply as you would into it, because this is a message I don't think gets out very often in our society.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk a long time about this if you want, but one of the distinctions I made in the book is the idea that um, before modern day, our modern day approach to work and all of this is burnout meant I worked too hard in the field and I need to sit down and rest. It was very physical, very much physical evidence that I'm tired. I need to drink water. I need to refuel. Now that's not our case. There are obviously a lot of people who still work outdoors and they still work, manual labor. They're putting their body to it, so they can get those cues that they need to rest. But man, I work in front of a computer all day. If I'm tired working in front of a computer, that's like I need to work out, right? Like if I'm tired, there's obviously some physical things I need to deal with, but there's a lot of emotional energy and a lot of, like you said, spiritual energy that goes into doing this. And I'm going to quote the Bible, but the Bible says that the spirit and the soul are impossible to divide. Only the Word of God can divide it, is what the Scripture says. But the idea that our soul and our spirit are highly tied together.
Mm-hmm.
We don't necessarily know. That's why a lot of church services, some people say they're overly emotional, right? Like, oh, it's just all emotions. But in my faith, we believe that the emotions and the spirit, you can't really tell them apart. Sometimes they are separate, but a lot of times they go hand in hand. The emotions it can be all emotion or all spirit and no emotion, right? But a lot of times they kind of move together. So I'm very careful to guard my emotional energy. That means, little things that I don't enjoy doing, and this seems very millennial of me, which I am. I don't go to the grocery store as much as possible. I don't mow my grass. There are things that kind of I dread, and they feel like they're things that I'm kind of dreading, not looking forward to, and zap my emotional energy. I guard those as much as possible so that when I do work, I can enjoy what I'm doing. I have energy to be creative. I have energy to problem solve. But yeah, it's really important that we guard those things so much, because it's shocking how many things take our emotional energy. Little conflicts that we encounter. So conflicts with our spouse. Obviously, I can't guard my emotional energy whenever my spouse and I have a fight, right? But I can guard it in other areas. So by setting boundaries with other people, by and I don't want to sound so millennial here, which I keep sounding millennial, but the idea that going to comment sections on Instagram posts. I was making a joke the other day that if you look at a post from a mom influencer, the comment section is horrible. They're posting a cute video of their daughter getting hooked up in their car seat, and moms will tear into them like, you're going to kill your daughter, you're putting her in there wrong, like all of these things that everyone's opinions that are kind of chipping away at our self-esteem, their maybe anger at us. Those are all things that chip away at our emotional and spiritual energy, and so we do need to be careful about guarding them. It's just so hard, and so you have to be intentional. Identify during the day, is this encounter right now adding energy to me or taking energy away? And reduce those things that take away your energy as much as possible is what I would encourage you to do.
Well, so I don't think that that's a millennial thing.
It is. It's the terms of like, safe space and all that. It's like, okay, there's all that conversation about that. It feels very millennial, but there's a truth to it.
Oh, I do the same. I wouldn't have been able to describe it that way probably, but as I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking, well, gosh, I do that. There are, I try and reduce the amount of time I have to be dealing with these things that I know will drain me. Mm-hmm. Right. And in one area of my life, I'm taking a real hit for doing that, because the people I'm staying away from don't like that I'm doing that. It's a legal thing, and I have to do it for my own kind of self-preservation. Mm-hmm. And I've talked to my therapist about it, and he's like, yes, of course you have to, right? So I think, I don't know, sometimes it seems like we almost need permission not to engage in these things, and that's where people sometimes get stuck. What is your thinking around that issue?
Well, I love the way you said it. You said, I need this to function. So there was the humility in that. A lot of times I think we say, you are doing this to me, or it's just, it comes down to humility. So when we set those boundaries, and people will get angry when we set those boundaries, we can approach it in humility and say, listen, I should be able to do this. I should be able to talk to you about this right now, but I just can't. I'm so exhausted and I'm so sorry. When we approach it with humility, it can hopefully lessen some of the anger that we experience when it comes to that. But then we can also realize, yeah, it is. We listen to our soul. We take stock in our soul. In the book, I don't know if you've ever seen it's a really popular show, Yosemite, the show Yosemite. Well, in it, there's this great scene where the grandson he's in the grandfather's house, and he's trying to pick the biggest cookie, and he said, I'm looking at all these cookies, but I can't decide which one's the biggest one. I can't decide which one I get. And so the grandfather says, well, take them all out. Look at them. He's like, and the grandson says, I can do that. And I love this line because he says, grandson, you can do whatever you want. Like, it's like, I just want you to this is your box of cookies. This is your house. And I think we need to have permission in our own souls to say, hey, this is your soul. Take stock. Look at what's in there. Open some things. In the book of Psalms, there's this from David. He says, search my heart, oh God, see if there's anything that doesn't make you happy, right? So it's kind of giving permission to look inside your soul and kind of rearrange and remove some things that aren't right. I think we need to do that for ourselves. I think, obviously a believer, I believe God can show me that, but I think there's something we can do about that, self-awareness of saying, this is not good that's in my soul right now. So I need to take stock and remove that.
Right. So I think you're exactly right. And one of my closest friends is an atheist. And we talk often about, because like you, I'm a believer, I'm a religious Jew, and
Mm-hmm.
our running joke is, I tell him, you're the most Jewish atheist I've ever met, and he says, you're the most atheistic Jew I've ever met, and we're not exactly sure what that means, but the reality is he probably has a greater desire for introspection and self-understanding and self-awareness than maybe any person I've met. So I think it is something we can do. I personally think it's easier to do it if you're living a God-centered life, because I see the struggles that he goes through. But people have to live and be well. But I do think we can all do that. So how do we engage in that process without scaring the heck out of ourselves?
Yeah, that's so I mean, I would, you talk about having faith. I would actually say that Christians are probably pretty bad at introspection. I would say the Jewish faith, when I look at what I call the Old Testament, it's very introspective, especially the Psalms, especially Ecclesiastes. There's very much introspection, understanding what's going on in your heart. Unfortunately, I feel like the Christian faith is like, let's just, okay, whatever pastor says, we're going to believe that, right? Like, well, does scripture actually say that? And maybe scripture seems like it contradicts itself. So obviously that can't be the truth if we believe it. So what does that really mean? What does that mean for us? There's very much that introspection. And I think it just comes down to humility, really, is understanding that I am probably 50% wrong on a lot of things. And what that means is I need to evaluate what I believe and why I believe it. And that comes down to some really deep soul parts. So I think humility is a key thing there. And we talk about that as one of the pillars, is that pride will actually take you out, because you make it all about, your vision, your goal, your thing that you're trying to accomplish. And you leave beaten, bloodied bodies along the wayside. But at the same time, you don't hear important correction that needs to come your way, or you don't evaluate things that need to change in your life. So yeah, it's tough. And especially I was talking to someone who works at a church in the UK, and I was really trying to encourage them, because I'm burnt out. I'm like, well, have you seen a counselor? And they're like, well, that's not really popular for UK Christians. And I'm like, well, Don't tell anyone, but go see a counselor, right? Because it is, there's been a stigma even in the past in the US. Hopefully I feel like the US is opening a lot more up to counseling, but especially Christians. But yeah, there's a stigma to this kind of feely, like what's going on in my heart sort of thing, but we have to acknowledge the reality of it. We're not just blood and bones and skin, right? There's a deeper part to us that we have to be in touch with.
So you hit on two things, and hopefully I'll remember the second one, because I want to address this issue, because I find myself confronting this issue quite often, and you brought up humility, which I remember being at a Sabbath table lunch quite a number of years ago, and the person who had invited me to the lunch asked us to go around the table and say, and answer the question, what do you think is most missing in American society? And my answer at that time was humility, because I do think it's the inability to take a step back, have a sense of, there's other people in the world, they have other perspectives. Just because their perspective is different from me does not make them evil. And that the only way to do that, as far as I can tell, is to come from that place of humility. So how do you see humility? Because I'm assuming you do. How do you see humility connected to avoiding burnout? If that does that make sense?
No, yeah. I mean, so we talk, in this book specifically, obviously, about ministry, where a lot of modern day pastors are getting into trouble. If you've seen any of the documentaries about, these mega churches that are just abusing people and doing horrible things, is we can set our vision as the most important thing. I'd say this in every area of our life. My business that I'm starting is the most important thing. And if we're doing something that makes a difference, if we're making, if we're making playing cards, okay, is that making a difference in the world? Maybe not, right? Like it doesn't feel like we're like changing the world. But a lot of the times, if we have this really passionate idea for a business, it's something that we think is going to help people. And as we engage in the business, as we engage in the church, we see people being helped, and we say, this is valuable, this is important, and I'm achieving this. And everything can be built in order to serve that vision. And as the leader, that vision is inextricably tied to me. So consequently, it can start feeling very narcissistic, where the business, the organization is accomplishing great things. It's making such an impact on people. We have to serve it at all costs. So I don't care if you're feeling bad right now. We got to accomplish this thing right now. We got to accomplish this task. And it very much becomes a narcissistic approach, and we don't realize it is, because we tie it to the organization, even though the organization is operating at the whims of my heart, right? So that's what we see a lot of times in the church, unfortunately. And people get into it with good motives. It's not like, I don't think most pastors that abuse their congregations get into it like, oh, I'm going to get as much as possible. We all have a desire to help, but it very quickly becomes about me and about what I'm wanting to do, and it can get you in trouble. So there's that aspect of humility, but there's also the aspect of, I need to value people enough to realize that there's something that I can learn from them. So my mom was one of the best people about this. It used to frustrate me to no end, but she would always, meet someone at church and introduce them to me and say, Jonathan, come meet this person. They do whatever, they study botany in college. And she thought that was the most fascinating thing in the world. She's legitimately fascinated by people, and she thinks there's something interesting about everyone. And I want to have that same characteristic in my life, because when we value people and we're fascinated by them, we say, okay, they think differently than me. They're not an idiot. So what must they know, or what perspective must they have that I don't have? And I believe that's just a foundation to, like you said, to kind of making peace. Okay, well, there's a large portion of the race that feels differently about a topic than I do, than my race does. So maybe if, hundreds of thousands of people are feeling this way, maybe I should listen up and hear what I'm missing. What am I missing here? Right. Like, that's a valuable thing. And there is this lack of humility in our culture right now, where we want to shut off anybody who believes differently than us and assume that they're just an idiot. And it leads to a really shallow and really small life. And small lives, I think, are prone to burnout, because when we're trying to accomplish something big in a small world, it's going to be too much for us, and we're not going to be able to do it.
That is, I think, a brilliant observation, if you'll allow me to engage in. I don't mean that hyperbolically. It's so powerful. It reminded me of when my first tour of duty as a chaplain, and I was assigned to Okinawa, Japan, and we only had half the number of chaplains that we were supposed to have, and the most senior one was getting ready to leave. And my wife had recently had our daughter, and she had come back to the United States. And so I was working, I don't know, 16, 20 hours a day, because there was nothing to govern my behavior. And the day before the senior chaplain left, he came to my office, and he said, did you submit to go to that conference that I want you to go to? And I said, no, Father. He was a Catholic priest. I said, no, Father, I didn't. I can't get away. I said, there's only going to be 3 of us after you leave for an 8-person, command. What are these other people supposed to do without me? It's like, I'm like, right. And he's like, I rarely give orders. I am ordering you to put in your paperwork to go to this conference, and you will do it before I detach tomorrow. Is that understood? Like, yes, sir. And I went to my desk and I put it, and the conference was sending me back to the United States, right? It took, that level for me to see that it wasn't about me, right? Yeah. And this, I mean, I'll say the chaplain's name, because I think he is a truly great man. Frank Puglisi is a Catholic priest. He was known all over Okinawa as being the chaplain's chaplain, so to speak, and he could see through all that. I suspect he had probably made many of those same mistakes as a young pastor himself, right? That's what it takes sometimes. And I was not, by the way, I was not a young man when that happened. I was my late 40s, so
yeah,
it shows you, I think somehow you've been sort of, ragging on millennials, but I think most of these issues are age universal.
Oh yeah. And that's what I love is I think as I get a little bit older, I'm starting to see some things on the other side. I was talking to my wife the other day about how I was at a checkout line at the grocery store, and I saw the young girl that was, helping me check out, and an attractive boy that was bagging the bags came by, and I just saw the hormone level shoot up. And it's just fun to see. It's fun to see those things that I went through that, and I experienced that, but I was so oblivious at the time of what was happening and how I must have looked to other people. And there is something with age where you look back and you just see, oh, I know what's going on right here. I lived that. And I think we have our marketing heavy culture that is always trying to get the next generation that has the next dollar to spend. We so focus on the next generation that we can tend to devalue older generations that maybe will see things that we don't see. And I love more Eastern cultures that value age and value that wisdom and say, I'm going to look to you because you've been 10 steps ahead of me this whole time, right? So I would love to see the US become a little bit less individualistic and a little bit more embracing of older generations.
Mm-hmm. So let me shift gears on you a little bit. When you talked about how people who lack humility live small lives, and if you're trying to accomplish big things, it living a small life is actually counterproductive. So talk more about that. I'm curious to know what more about what you mean by that, because I have an idea in my head as to maybe what you're talking about, but I'd like to know, a broader perspective on that, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, I'll dip into church culture again, since that's what I know that quite
Absolutely.
intimately, and I think it's something interesting for your listeners is that there's this mentality that most churches won't grow over 100 people, and that's the case. Like, but then there's some churches that will grow to 1,000 people, and that's where they kind of stay. Like they just kind of stay there, right? And people are always trying to figure out, why does a church get to this certain level and stop? And I have seen that it largely has to do with the capacity of the pastor to manage everything, to control everything.
Mhm.
Most people can operate with 100 people and they can control that pretty well, where, I everything excellent will come through me. And at some point it stops though. I can no longer grow past that because I have to be in control of everything. Some people, they seem to break the rule and they get to 1,000, but it's the same thing. They stop there because they have to be in control of everything. And often the thing that was the greatest asset while we were building something can be the thing that holds us back. And that thing is usually our control, because I mean, I have a high eye for excellence. So in my business, I'm tempted to have my hand in everything and say, hey, run that through me, run that idea through me, send me that graphic, and I want to control everything. And I've had to learn that I can't do that. If it's going to grow beyond me,
Mhm.
and not destroy me, I have to start letting go of more things. So that's one of the chapters actually in the book, is the idea of letting go of control. But how do you actually know what to let go of? How do you know what you should keep control? Because obviously there needs to be a level of control, a level of managing, and that's a really hard thing for a lot of people. I tend to go back to the things that give me energy. I try to not control, but I try to have my hand in. The things that don't, I decide to trust people and say, I've hired the right people, and I'm going to trust that they're going to be able to manage that themselves. And then hopefully at the point at which they need to expand and let go of control, to be able to do that as well.
Right, right. So, and you're hitting on the sort of classic challenge that a business founder has, right? He
Mhm.
starts the business and he's its everything. But if the business is going to grow, that founder needs to be able to let go of some areas of control. And that's oftentimes why you see founders, having to move on out of the
Mhm.
business because they can't let go. And it's a choice of either the business is going to collapse or the founder has to step aside and let, so-called professional management come in and take the business to the next level, or let the
Or
next.
they're going to burn out trying to manage it, which is
Right.
often. I mean, I think I was nearing that at some point, because Sunday Socially grown quite a bit larger than I could manage by myself, and I realized, okay, first of all, it's not a side hustle, because I started it as like a side hustle, and then I'm like, also, I something needs to change here. I need to bring in other people to hold up these pillars of the company, things that I'm really good at them. Like I did really good. I grew it to a really good size by myself. But in order to maintain and have healthy excitement about the business and just not burn out, I needed to bring those people in. And it's always a struggle. Even if you've done it 1,000 times before, it's still a struggle, because you're letting go of something like, I can do this better than they can.
Right.
But you have to realize, I got to let go of that.
Yeah. So, and you brought up an interesting point, that I think sometimes we miss in our. I don't mean self-centeredness in a negative way. I just mean we only have our perceptions, and that is something that I may find very, boring or dispiriting or energy draining, but
Mhm.
someone else may find that to be quite fascinating, and they'll be energized by it, and so I'm better off letting them do that thing, right? I mean,
It shocks me when I encounter those people. I'll check in with employees sometimes. I'm like, are you sure you're really enjoying your job right now? Because I would hate doing what you're doing. And they're like, yeah, I love it. And, there's so many other parts of management that go into making someone enjoy their job besides just the work. But yeah, it's shocking to see that there are people who love the things that I find dreadful.
okay, so I want to go now, back but forward. You mentioned when you talked about your mom. So you said she was the kind of person who was or is fascinated by other people. So do you think that was kind of inbuilt It was, it was inherent in her? Was it something that she built herself into? How do you think that came about? And like you, I think that's an enormously desirable trait to have. So for those of us who don't have it, how can we create that ability or that trait?
Yeah, unfortunately, it was something built into her. She was naturally that way. But I remember my dad would always tell the story of a guy who was his pastor, and this guy he just loved people. Like he was that type of, he would remember details about you. He would always check in on you. And I remember my dad was saying he talked to him one time and asked him, like, man, you're just so naturally gifted that way. And the guy said, actually, I'm not. I had to learn to be that way. So he taught himself how to be that way. And I do believe it's possible. But what he would do is he made it a studying task. He would write note cards of people's names and details about them, and he would study them during the week. And it's one of those things that whenever we create the discipline, our hearts tend to kind of follow along with that. It's like the people who work out, right? Like anyone who's obsessed with working out, they weren't always obsessed with it. They got into it, they built the discipline, they saw the results of it, and it changed their minds toward it. And I think that can happen with us when it comes to being genuinely interested in people, is that we can teach ourselves to be that way. I remember How to Win Friends and Influence People. That's one of the tenets of influencing people, is being genuinely interested in people. But same thing, I think there's a bit in it about how to actually become interested in people. And I do believe it's possible to learn, but discipline is the key.
Okay. So wait a minute. Oh, okay. I was looking at the wrong thing. I said, okay, we still have a few more minutes. Good.
Yeah.
So next question. Those of us who are parents, presumably we want to build resilient children, right? And we want to inspire resiliency in our spouse. And yet it seems like those are the people we have, in many ways, the least influence on. I don't know if you looked at this, but how would you recommend we convey, the kind of ideas that we've been talking about to those closest to us, our family members?
I mean, I saw my dad. My dad was a pastor. He was a great example of this. There's this notorious thing that pastors' kids are known of, for going off the rails, being massively rebellious, being the crazy ones, rejecting their parents. And I can't say 100% because I have some great pastor friends who've had kids who've rebelled and they've done what I'm going to suggest. But for me, it was really interesting to see how my dad lived his life. Obviously, his lessons, they still echo in my head, but I remember most things that I saw him do. So he had just been invited to be this pastor of this church, and I went with the youth group to youth camp, and I came back with blue hair. And he had just become the pastor, and his son comes back with blue hair. I wasn't being rebellious. I just thought it would be fun to get blue hair. The people at camp had told me it'd wash out in 2 washes. It didn't wash out in 2 washes. But I come back, and he could have been so embarrassed, and he could have, gotten so mad at me. But he believed that you only punish rebellion. You don't punish just foolishness, right? And he abided by that. He didn't let his embarrassment or potential embarrassment let him act contrary to his values. He was very consistent with his values. What he believed in is what he acted on. And I do believe kids see that more than anything, is that you are consistent with your words, because our words mean nothing, like, hey, don't be mean to people. And then my dad gets mad at me and he's mean to me, right? Like, okay, well, obviously you don't believe that. So consistency is so hard. Again, going back to discipline, is he was slow to act, and he would say, okay, I'm feeling embarrassed right now, but did my son do anything wrong? No, he didn't. I'm not going to punish him. He would frequently not punish me for things that other parents would destroy their kids for. And he was like, he's just being a dumb kid, right? Like, so consistency, I think, is the key. Doing what you want to teach them. When they see you acting a certain way, I believe kids are going to fall in line with that.
And so I think agree with you with respect to kids, and I, like with my daughter, I do my best to, practice that. With, I mean, we all make mistakes, right? At times. How do we work with our spouses on this, right? Because they're not our children. They're meant to
Yeah.
walk through life with us, right? How do we do that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I'm still learning this. I've been married 13 years as of 3 days ago. um,
Congratulations.
but yeah, so it's always a challenge because my tendency is to try to teach my wife because I think I'm pretty awesome and I think she should realize I'm pretty awesome too. But I've tried to learn to submit my ideas to her. Um, there's this idea of mutual submission frequently in the Bible, submit one to another. So whenever I have something that I strongly believe is important for my career or for X in my life, I say, this is what I'm thinking. I can only do what I can do, right? So I tell her, this is what I'm thinking I should do. This is why I think I should do it. But what do you think? And legitimately, so there have been many times I've been invited to speak at a conference, and I'll say, I think this would be good for my career, but I don't know. I don't want to be, away from you and my son. So what do you think I should do? And I leave it up. I'm not going to get mad at her if she says you shouldn't go. There have been so many times that she's told me to go, right? I think that type of thing again is action being modeled of, when I value you so much that I'm willing to not do something because I love you and I care about a relationship. Again, I still think actions speak louder than, I mean, as if I'm the person who came up with this, right? But actions will speak louder than words. So, I think a lot of times whenever our spouse doesn't get it, it's because we're maybe not able to model it properly. We can do it at work, but we can't do it at home, right? Being the same person at work as you are at home, especially for guys who are very compartmental in the way we think, right? Typically the stereotypical guy, right? It can be that way where we're like, we'll act at work a certain way and then we can't act that same way at home. So, man, consistency across is pretty important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, so we are coming up close to the end of our time. So I want to make sure that, if I do a shameless plug for your book. So Kelly didn't send me a copy. Do you happen to have a copy of the book that you can?
I do. Don't Burn Out, Burn Bright, right there. So again, available at don'tburnoutburnbright.com. I would highly recommend you take that assessment. We've had people responding like, wow, this confirms some stuff that I've been hearing in counseling. So it's a valuable test, even if you don't read the book, but I do believe there's actually value in the book as well.
Okay. And we'll put a link to both the assessment and where the book can be bought in the show notes so that
Perfect.
people can do that. Is the book only available on your website, or is it available at Amazon and all those other places too? Or?
Yeah, Amazon, Audible, Barnes & Noble, audiobooks.com, pretty much anywhere you buy a book, you'll be able to find it.
Okay. So I'm going to answer the first part of my last question, which is how do we get started? And how we get started, I think, would be, buy the book, take the assessment. Where do we go from there? Once we've done those two things, how, should we just like read the book straight through? How do we get started in creating what amounts to greater resilience in our lives?
Yeah, I mean, the assessment will give you one of the 10 things. That's really what the assessment yields you. And so it'll tell you what specific chapter to read. So you can skip to it, but I do believe there's a holistic approach to our life where, each piece is not compartmentalized, right? Each piece affects the other piece. So, work on the thing that you feel like is burning you out the most, but then move on to the next thing of saying, okay, now I have my boundaries in order, but now do I need to release some control in certain areas? And how do I need to do that? So, take with everything, you climb Mount Kilimanjaro one step at a time, right? So take a tiny step, and that step is going to be revolutionary, but then there's a next step to take after that. So that's what I would encourage you to do.
Okay. Is there do you have besides your website, do you have social media where people can contact you?
Yeah. So if you work in a church and you think you want to see some funny videos about that, I do that on Instagram. I make reels that are just absolutely ridiculous, but it's fun to do. So Jonathan Malm on Instagram. Even if you don't work at a church and you're just curious about something, hit me up. I love responding to people. I love talking to people. Again, I'm an extrovert, so that gives me life. If I don't respond in a week, you'll know that I'm extroverted out for a little bit, but normally I respond pretty quickly.
Okay, I'll put that link in the show notes as well.
All right.
So Jonathan, I mean, there's even more to unpack here, and I may have to have you come back and talk about some of the stuff. I am going to take that assessment. I do find those kind of tools very, very useful. It's hard to get insight into ourselves, and so especially it sounds like it's a pretty easy tool to use, and so I'm going to take that and sort of spread it around. So I'm going to have you hang tight here for just a couple of minutes while I wrap it up, and that is, first of all, to thank all of you for joining us out there in social media land. I appreciate you tuning in. Please do consider getting Jonathan and Jason's book. A lot, more so than many of the guests I've had in a while. Jonathan and Jason are really looking at that term holistic. They're really looking at the heart of what the 3 pillars of attainment are designed to do. And as I've said before, this is not magic, or this is not the only way you can look at these things. This is just hopefully a helpful way to sort of organize our thoughts and how we approach our lives. But I encourage you, like I said, to get that and to engage in this, because so much of resiliency or so much of life is about resiliency. Just to review a couple of things. So humility, discipline, self-awareness, these are all factors that Jonathan identified that will help us on that journey to greater resiliency. And I think it is a journey. It's not a place where we're going to get to, right? It's a continuous, sometimes a struggle, sometimes a delight. But I think if we have some basic principles in our mind, we will make progress in getting there. So I thank you for like I say, tuning in. I hope you will find these thoughts useful. We will be back again next week, starting on Monday at 10 a.m. with Trust and Estates Weekly, 10 a.m. Pacific time. On Tuesday will be the next edition of Business Lessons from the Military at 11 a.m. Pacific time. And then a week from today, we will be back with the next episode of People Making Money. And so I invite you to tune into all of the Way to Wow shows. And if you've missed any of them, or if you've seen today's show and you would really, someone who would benefit from hearing what Jonathan had to say, direct them to our YouTube channel, The Way to Wow. I'm sorry, youtube.com/@thewaytowwow. And you can see this episode, as well as many, many other great speakers and great ideas that people have shared over the many, many episodes that we've done. And while you're there, maybe you'll subscribe. Shameless plug for the channel. So, Jonathan, I want to thank you one last time for joining us, and congratulations on the new book. It appears to be adding to an ever enlarging canon, and that's terrific. I've only written one book, and you're right. You do not make money writing books, but hopefully you share good ideas and good knowledge. So thanks for coming on the show. And
thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're very, very welcome. And just want to sign off, as I always do, by reminding her, Marie, darling, you are and ever will be my belle. So you all have a wonderful rest of the day and rest of the week, and look forward to seeing you next week.